Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for coming to our final session covering the Old Testament in our Roadmap series. So this semester, we were able to go through all the books starting from 1 Kings all the way to Nehemiah, which finishes out the narratives in chronological order. And what we're going to do now, if you remember the second session after we finished up 2 Samuel, is we went through all the wisdom literature, all the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, poetry sections of the Bible, and we're going to do something similar and do kind of a bonus episode getting through all the prophets. We briefly mentioned the written prophets when we were in the second part of 2 Kings, and what we're going to focus on is we're not going to obviously go through them like we've been going through the narratives, but we're just going to touch on each of them, get you an idea of where they land chronologically and kind of their theme and message that each of these prophets want to present. So if you go ahead and look at your table of contents, you'll notice that everything from starting in Isaiah all the way to Malachi, this whole section are the actual, you can think of them like the epistles of these prophets. So just like the New Testament has the ending part with these letters from Paul and James and Peter and the like, the end of the Old Testament has the letters or the oracles or the stories of these old prophets that were living during the time after Elijah and Elisha. And if you remember, I really encourage you to look back, especially if you're viewing this through YouTube, on our session all the way back to 2 Kings from chapter 13 forward. If you remember in that part, we have Elijah who prophesied early on after the two kings were divided, and then he was succeeded by Elisha. Of course, we don't have any written records of what they wrote about. But following the generation following Elisha, that's when these written prophets start. So we're going to start, and your Bible is going to be ordered by length, but I'm going to go ahead and order it by chronology. And it's a rough chronology, and I split it up, if you look at your notes, into 4 generations or 4 sections. So right after Elisha passes away, that's when you get to the last days of the northern kingdom, which falls in 722 BC. So if you remember, there's very few, after Elisha dies, there's only going to be very few prophets for the northern kingdom, because it collapses pretty early on in 2 Kings after chapter 13. And so there's really 3 prophets that are from the northern kingdom, and those prophets are Hosea, Amos, Jonah, and so those are the earliest prophets, and then right after that would be Isaiah and Micah. So we're going to cover that section first if you look in your next page of your notes. So like I said, Hosea is going to be the early prophet from the northern kingdom, and he is perhaps most famous for his story at the very beginning of chapter 1. The Lord instructs him to marry this prostitute and have these, cursed children. And what this is illustrating is Israel's abandonment of the Lord. So just as a husband goes or a wife goes and, commits adultery or fornicates with someone outside of their marriage, that is the illustration that God is putting as Israel is going, is cheating on God pretty much, going to other gods, going to other idols. And this is symbolically shown by the prophet marrying this prostitute. And you see many of these images of adultery, of a family relationship. There's a lot of public shaming of Gomer. But afterwards, there's a repentance and redemption for her as well. So this is kind of what Hosea is getting at, is that even though Israel is going astray, there is restoration after they're punished and they're judged. So Amos is similarly also from the northern kingdom, prophesying around the same time. He's actually cattle breeders, so many of these prophets aren't professional prophets. They're just your everyday Joes that God suddenly calls to speak truth to power. And so Amos would be a very powerful speaker and will go even to the highest authorities of the lands of Samaria. And in chapter 10 or chapter 7, he'll even confront Amaziah, who is the high priest of the shrine in Bethel. And if you remember, the shrine in Bethel, that was some sort of apostasy spin-off of the Jerusalem shrine that Jeroboam set up. So he condemns those. Not only does he condemn the worship, but what is he most famous for? He's very famous for not only condemning bad worship, but for social justice and social reform. So he's very much targets those who are oppressed, almost like the Sermon on the Mount. He's very much wants to lift up the meek and those of a lower social status, and says that the Lord is looking out for you and will raise you up in due time. So that is what Amos is about. Jonah is very different. So Jonah, if you remember from 2 Kings, he is the advisor for Jeroboam II, and helps advise him and tells him that he's going to go and take over some of the land that Aram, his enemy, since he's going to be distracted with Assyria, Jeroboam is going to be successful in conquering and recapturing a lot of the land that was lost. And but the book of Jonah is completely different. So this is way later, assumingly, in Jonah's life. And instead of having an oracle, it's more of just a story. So it's just like a narrative, much more like Esther or Ruth, just kind of a short story with a purpose to it. And in this purpose, Jonah is being called to go to Nineveh, which, if you know, during that time would be a very infamous city where, Assyria, the biggest empire in the world, is conquering and ruling the whole Middle East as we know it. And Jonah obviously doesn't want to go there. It's dangerous, and so he goes to Joppa, which is right off the coast of near Jerusalem, and he'll sail way, way far away, all the way to Tarshish, which is probably going to be around modern-day Spain. So go in the complete opposite direction. Assyria's over here. He's, Flight 93 and all the way to the ends of the earth. And after that, he goes and encounters these merchant sailors that are probably Phoenician. And what you'll see is a major theme is God's heart for those who are not only non-Israelites, but enemies of the Lord. So you'll see failures from this prophet of Yahweh, Jonah, running away from God, and these sailors who are Phoenician, who are foreign, speaking truth about God and praying to their gods, but God is revealing that whose fault is it? It's his own prophet's fault, Jonah's fault for the storm that's causing the whole ship to go into peril. So he voluntarily throws himself overboard, gets into this fish that swallows him up. He's in the belly 3 days, prays, and then after praying and repenting to God that maybe he shouldn't have done this, the whale or the fish spits him out, and then he goes, and God once again tells him to go to Nineveh. This time he listens. So he goes to Nineveh, and a twist ending happens where we're expecting these people to, of course, not want to repent. They're arrogant. They have they're the mightiest emperor. Why would they worship this God of a small nation? But they end up repenting and getting saved, and then Jonah is disappointed. He's like, oh my goodness, I thought, I knew God had a compassionate heart, but these people are monsters. They don't deserve this. They've slaughtered so many innocent people. But it just goes to show that God's heart is very graceful, even those who are not only non-Israelites outside the family of God, but also to enemies of Israel, famous enemies. So just like, if you remember Ruth, right, she was a Moabite, an enemy of Israel, and she became the great-grandmother of the greatest king ever to rule Israel. So it just shows how God can work outside of this closed niche, exclusive group of followers. So it's a really cool story there. Isaiah, the next book. So Now those are the three prophets of the northern kingdom, and that's the only prophets that we'll hear about. The rest, obviously, is going to be from Judah, because a short time later, like I alluded to, Israel is going to be no more. So, meanwhile in Jerusalem, Isaiah is perhaps one of the most famous and most quoted prophets of the Old Testament. And if you remember him, when we went over 2 Kings, he is a really prominent figure in the historical account. So he's the advisor to King Ahaz, who, if you remember, was going through a dilemma. He had Assyria coming up, this big rising empire who was gobbling up all the nations around Israel and Judah. And he had a choice. He had Israel in the north, and also Aram wanted to gang together to resist Assyria, and they wanted to force Judah's hand to go and fight with them. But Ahaz, was basically like, no way, I'm going to, turn my back around and join the Assyrians and against my fellow, the Israelites up north and Aram, and decided to think that was a politically smart move, even though Isaiah was insisting to trust God, not trusting nations. So Ahaz makes a mistake of, being a willing vassal for Assyria. Obviously, Israel and Aram, they died, or, they fell. Their kingdoms collapsed shortly thereafter. And then after they collapsed, who was next on the list? It was Judah and Jerusalem, right? So Sennacherib has his sights set on Jerusalem. A new king comes to power, Hezekiah. But does Hezekiah make the same decision Ahaz did? No, right? So other than, unlike Ahaz, Hezekiah makes a decision to listen to Isaiah, trusting God, and knowing that no matter what political fallout he's having, he's going to trust Yahweh all the way. And so what ends up happening is that he prays, he follows Isaiah's advice, and Isaiah will foretell that Sennacherib will leave and have to flee, and of course he does. After setting up a siege, a plague comes, and he has to disperse and go back to Nineveh. So Isaiah is most famous for those accounts, but the rest of the book is talking about his prophecies around that time. And a lot of his prophecies emphasizes this messianic prophecy. This is the first major prophet that we're going to see allusions to a Messiah that's going to be the ultimate Savior for Israel. And not only that, we're going to have themes of a universal centrality of Jerusalem, where Jerusalem will not only be the center of worship for Israelites, but for the whole world. The whole world will come to Jerusalem to worship there. And so he kind of sets that tone for the rest of the prophets that we'll see with these big major ideas. Interestingly enough, so after chapter 39 and before that is going to recount the events we talked about in 2 Kings about Hezekiah overcoming Sennacherib. But starting in chapter 40, it jumps up into time. So we go from 8th century prophecy to now we're fast forward into the Babylonian Exile. So it's not unclear what's taking place here, whether this is Isaiah or one of his followers that are going with them into the exilic period, or if this is a vision of Isaiah, fast forward into the exile. But in either sense, this is the perspective is coming from those who are, destroyed and left homeless after the Babylonian exile. And then towards the end, I believe starting in around chapter 50, there's going to be a perspective of the reaction to the temple being rebuilt and kind of the disappointments that happen. So obviously, when you remember from Erza-Nehemiah, the temple gets rebuilt, but there's still rubble. There's still a lot that, it's not made of the same amazing, immaculate, glory that it once had. And so there's a lot of disappointment and a lack of splendor there. And Isaiah or his successors try to wrestle with that fact. And so Isaiah really stretches all the way from, before when the monarch was still in full swing until much later into the post-exile period. Next is Micah. He is a fellow prophet along with Isaiah ministering in Jerusalem. And he, just like Amos, is talking to the southern kingdom, talking about a divine judgment and an exile. And unlike Isaiah, who doesn't really talk about the destruction of Jerusalem until after chapter 40, he is warning that Jerusalem is not safe. So even though they think that God staying in his temple, he's going to protect it, Micah is very clear that due to poor leadership, that the spirit or the kavod of the Lord is going to be abandoned, leaving it to be destroyed eventually. So this is long, long before Babylon's even a threat. And so that is what he is most famous for. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next era. So that's kind of the first generation after Elijah and Elisha. Now we're going to go to the second generation. So Assyria's fallen, and there's a time of a lot of what's going to happen next. We have Babylon kind of on the rise, but they're not at their full strength yet. And at the same time, there's a lot of turmoil with this, worldwide empire that has just collapsed. So following the collapse of Nineveh in 612 BC. So the next book we're going to go over covers this time period really well. And it's the Prophet of Nehu, who isn't as much, isn't the star of his own book as much as he's proclaiming the fall of Nineveh. And that's what his whole book focuses on. So it's very much like a poem, poetic justice of this evil, tyrannical empire who was on top of the world, and, how the mighty had fallen, and how the righteous Israelites were justified. They were going to be okay, but not this evil empire. And so this is just a poem celebrating the events of Assyria finally falling. I put Joel in here. He is a weird prophecy. It's like, so the way we date these books, like we talked about earlier, is that there's no date, unless the author specifically says, at this year, or this king, or this event, we don't know the exact date, or we'd have to look at the contents to really know what time period it's talking about. But Joel is the most mysterious out of all of these prophecies because he doesn't date anything and he's very vague in his vision. But basically the whole book is primarily just this awful, terrible vision of this foreign invader that's coming to the land and in the form of this locust. And he illustrates and showing that this is, the Lord's judgment coming onto Israel. So I just placed him here because I think it's Babylon. You can agree or disagree, but I'm going to interpret it. I'm going to, go out on a limb and say that he's talking about Babylon coming. But there's a lot of different time periods that this can fall under. Zephaniah is going to cover the period, a very specific period of Josiah. So if you remember, Josiah's grandfather, Manasseh, was an awful ruler who made Jerusalem go astray, and the Lord was so upset with how atrocious his practices were, was that he's had enough. He's like, okay, I can't, tolerate this any longer, and Jerusalem will one day pay for all of this. And this is kind of the atmosphere that was happening during the time of Josiah, right before he discovered the scroll and led to his reforms. But if you remember, his reforms still weren't good enough to turn away this great wrath, and God did end up destroying Jerusalem regardless because of how bad Manasseh was. So Zephaniah really covers this period and talks about all the doom and judgment that's going to be coming upon the house of Manasseh, the house of Jerusalem, for all of these wicked deeds that Manasseh did. And but at the end, he mentions all these stern judgment, but there's optimism that there's going to be repentance and a future restoration at the end of this doom and gloom. So that is what Zephaniah talks about. Jeremiah, also a very important prophet in a specific point of time. If you remember from Kings, he is extremely prominent because he was the eyewitness. So he ministered right before the fall of Jerusalem, and he ministered during the actual collapse and war that was happening at Jerusalem. And he also ministered to a remnant that went to Egypt right after the disaster at the Babylonian Exile. So Jeremiah is a really important book. And what I love about Jeremiah is that it's not just one genre, it's not just his oracles. You have so many different writings collected that's preserved in the book of Jeremiah. You have a lot of his sermons, famously the temple sermon he does in chapter 7, talking about proper worship. He does more of these very public sermons in the palace, or I think the city gates, another one. He has personal diaries where he's lamenting, where he's praying, and obviously goes through the narrative that we talked about that 2 Kings doesn't cover. So he goes in much more detail about the fall of Jerusalem, more so than any other account in the Bible. And he is most famous for being seen as a traitor during his lifetime. So if you read his work, he's very pro-Babylonian in the sense that he feels like Babylon is the vehicle in which God's harsh judgment is going to fall upon Jerusalem, and we should just accept it. And the Lord just uses very stern warnings to Jeremiah. He tells Jeremiah, don't even pray for these people because they're so far gone into their sins. And so Jeremiah is just a very, very harsh critic. He eventually gets condemned as a traitor. He's thrown into a well or a cistern. And then he also witnesses, he's one of the last confidants that Zedekiah will see before he's killed by Nebuchadnezzar. And so he's just a very consequential prophet, and I really, instead of just hearing a summary, I really implore you to read his book. Also, Lamentations. So Lamentations take place right after Jeremiah. You can think of it as a companion piece to Jeremiah, specifically talking about the fall of Jerusalem. So Lamentations just is a collection of poems about the horrors of that day. It goes into very vivid details of the famine, just the terribleness that happened. It talks about cannibalism. It talks about what happened on the streets, babies dying in their mother's arms, in very, very vivid ways of just how awful and terrible the Babylonian invasion was. So that is all in the book of Lamentations. Obadiah is next. Again, that's another a book that's kind of hard to date, but chronologically, the events that it's referencing is in the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem. So after the fall of Jerusalem, Obadiah is talking about Edom. If you remember, Jerusalem falls, and Ammon and Edom and all these smaller nations around, will be gleeful and maybe capitalize according to Obadiah. Edom kind of capitalizes and takes advantage of and loots the city of whatever's left over. And Obadiah is really condemning of this behavior. And so that is all that this short one chapter is about. Next is Habakkuk. So Habakkuk is another interesting book that's not formatted the same way as many of the other books of the prophets. So unlike a usual prophet where God will speak and the prophet will speak on God's behalf, this is actually a dialogue between Habakkuk, the prophet, and God. And so Habakkuk is struggling, and he's kind of asking the age-old question of, why do bad things happen to good people? Why is it that, your righteous people are, being persecuted and destroyed by this, horrible, monstrous nation called Babylon? And so he's asking God, he's complaining, and how can God just stand by and be idle when all this terribleness is happening? And so God answers him in a very similar solution that Nahum has. So, in Nahum, it was God's timing that Assyria would eventually fall, and the same story is going to happen to Babylon. So, the resolution is, to stay strong. So, even though it seems like, evil is overtaking the world, that it seems like, the bad guys are going to win at the end, don't worry. God has it where those who are patient, those who are persevering, those who trust the Lord, even though it seems like nonsense, they will persevere, while those who seem on top of the world right now will fall and have a great fall. So that's kind of how Habakkuk, resolves that answer. So now that's the second generation of written prophets. now we're going to focus on the two prophets that are not in Jerusalem, not in Israel, but prophesy during their exile in Babylon. So if you remember, about 10 years before Jerusalem is destroyed, Jehoiakim and a lot of the royalty and a lot of the treasuries from the temple are brought out of Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, but they don't destroy it, right? So they just loot some of their people, loot some of their goods, and install Zedekiah to be their puppet ruler in 597. And so during this initial wave of those who are captured back include Ezekiel and Daniel. And in the book of Ezekiel, he writes, starting right after he's taken captive to Babylon, he has a famous vision in Ezekiel 1 talking about this coming destruction. So he's ministering to the exiled community, and in chapters 1 through 24, it talks about basically he's illustrating to the Israelites that, this isn't just a one-time thing. Like, this is going to end really badly. God's no longer in Jerusalem. His spirit's left. You see this vision of God, fleeing from Jerusalem, and it's going to fall and it's going to be destroyed. And you have all these really bizarre stories of how he illustrates that. The most bizarre probably of him, eating his own feces. Another one where he's, turning on his back for a certain amount of days, talking about, symbolizing the years of exile, and then another on his right side where he just lays down and doesn't move, talking about another, something relates to the exile. So he has these really strange public acts to illustrate to the exiles what God is doing. And then towards the end, so in the middle part, you have kind of a typical, warnings against other nations, and then chapter 33 through 48 is basically the aftermath. 586 has happened, Jerusalem has fallen, God's house is destroyed, and how do we deal with that? And but it ends on a pretty optimistic note. Most famously, he talks about the valley of the dry bones. So you have this vision of a Jerusalem wasteland where there's all these bones, but God will breathe the life into these bones and they'll resurrect up. And so this is famous for really alluding to a resurrection for the first time in the Bible. And then also, the very end, he talks about just this glorious future temple. And if you can think forward to the New Testament book of Revelation, this is very much a precursor to that. How you have this gorgeous temple where God is going to be worshipped for eternity, and the fire will never go out, and to kind of this idealistic temple that is going to be will never be destroyed, never will fall. And so he gives us this really graphic detail of this great future temple to look forward to. And the next is Daniel, who also goes with Ezekiel into exile, but unlike Ezekiel, he's not going to be with the common people. He's actually going to be chosen and handpicked by Nebuchadnezzar to go and get educated, have a Babylonian education, and serve in his court along with three of his friends. We all know them: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There are Daniel and the trio. They work as kind of the high officials in the Nebuchadnezzar's court. Famously, Daniel will interpret his vision and will get promoted to the right-hand man of Nebuchadnezzar. But of course, Daniel and the three are going to have enemies that are going to try to get them killed. And so they try to accuse them of not worshiping the statue, and that ends up getting the three of them thrown into the furnace, but famously they don't burn. And then Daniel is called out for worshiping God and calling out to God and not the God of Nebuchadnezzar, and that gets him thrown into the lion pit, which famously, God muzzles their mouth, and the king is gleeful and sees that Daniel saved and worships his God and throws those who accused him back into the lion pit to get his revenge. And so chapters 1 through 6 is a narrative, more or less like Jonah, in the sense that it's just a story about a prophet, not prophecies. But then starting from chapter 7 to chapter 12, that's all, not only is it prophecies, but they're visions. So there's 4 specific visions that God reveals to him. And we first get names of certain angels for the first time in the Bible. So we learn about the Archangel Michael and then Gabriel, which I'm sure will be a pretty big deal when we get to the beginning of the gospel story. But anyways, a lot of these visions are alluding to very specific prophecies that are going to happen in the intertestamental period. So when we get to the book of Maccabees and the Maccabean Revolt, when Jerusalem gets its independence from a foreign empire, and where we get the celebration of Hanukkah after, when we go to that in the very beginning of our next session, we're going to learn more about these prophecies that Daniel foretells. All right, so that is the prophecy of the exile. Now we're getting to our last period, the time of Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So the books of Haggai and Zechariah are prophets of the first wave. If you remember from the book of Ezra, it's 3 accounts, and the very first account is going to be Zerubbabel and Jeshua, and they are going to go and rebuild the temple, and Haggai and Zechariah are going to encourage them, because what's going to happen, if you remember, the king stops them, right? So they get enemies in the land that, spread false rumors, and then the Persian authorities say, okay, you guys got to knock it off, stop the construction of the temple. They end up, maybe not even stopping it. They might have, destroyed whatever they worked on, their whole progress. And so obviously the people that return there are discouraged. They made like a 4-month journey, into a wasteland and built all this up for no reason, and left the comforts of Babylon to go to this, rebuild this ruinous city of Jerusalem. But Haggai is like, no, this is what God is calling for. And if you read Haggai, it's very much it's structured very much like a companion piece to Zerubbabel's account. So Zerubbabel's account is in Ezra 1 through 6, but Haggai is also very meticulous, almost kind of like its own account. It has very specific dates. It has 4 directions, and it's talking specifically to Zerubbabel in its specific time and place in its historical context. So he's talking to him about this year of King Darius, this is what God is talking to Zerubbabel. And he does that 4 more times, and then he kind of alludes to the final one before his 4th instruction, the foundation of the temple is built. So it's just a very, very interesting book that really goes well hand in hand with Ezra 1 through 6. The next is Zechariah. So Zechariah is similar to Haggai, except his prophecies aren't just targeting Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the high priest. He is mainly focused on 8 specific visions guided by an angel, kind of like what we find in the book of Daniel. And he emphasizes future events that are still to come. And he is imagining during the time where Jerusalem was this vast wasteland, but says that not only will it come to its peak back in the monarch days, but it's going to be even bigger. So this is where you get visions of Jerusalem being like the pinnacle of the world. It's going to be, the place to worship for everybody, and have authority over all nations. So you get these very large-scale visions and grandeur of the city of Jerusalem and the temple. And then at the very end, in chapter 14, you see like this large-scale cosmic battle. So you have, Jerusalem standing by itself, and then all the enemies, approaching Mount Zion, where Jerusalem is. And then God just kind of, defeats all these enemies, has a huge plague, and this huge plague will wipe out most of the nations of the world. And those who survive will go make a pilgrimage, just like the Jews make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover. Will go and worship, make a pilgrimage, and serve Yahweh for all time. So he's very famous for this vision. The last one, the very last book, is Malachi. So Malachi is part of Erza-Nehemiah and the part of the second wave of returnees 50 years after the time of Zerubbabel and the temple being built. And he will reinforce Ezra's message against intermarriages with the outsiders. He exhorts the returnees to go back and do proper temple worship, priesthood conduct, tithes, all of those. If you remember the very end of Nehemiah, all those problems that arose, he addresses a lot of Nehemiah's reforms. And then the second half of the book talks about, it's a lot like Zechariah, so it's going back into kind of this apocalyptic future where he's referring to a messenger, so that this messenger is going to come, he's going to bring judgment. And at the very last, it famously reads a really good bridge into the New Testament. He says, "I will send a prophet Elijah to you before the great and fearful day of the Lord comes." Where it says he'll reconcile a child to a parent and parent to child. And this mysterious prophecy is going to be a big deal in the first century Jews who are looking out for a Messiah. And when we read John the Baptist's movement, what is he, who is he looking for? He's looking for, are you Elijah? Are you this Elijah that Malachi is referring to? So Malachi, along with Zechariah and a lot of these prophecies, are going to be foretelling and foreshadowing this messianic, really starting with Isaiah, this messianic mover who's not only going to return and restore Jerusalem back to its former glory, but have this eternal kingdom where God is going to be it, and all nations will go and bow before him with this new Messiah. And so when we come back next time and we look at the New Testament, we're going to have all of this knowledge equipped with us. We're going to have the context. We're going to have everything to really examine what were the Jews thinking of? What were, the disciples of Jesus? Who was Jesus? How was he seen? How was he understood? And a lot of these questions are going to be really well answered since we've had this background about these prophets and about the events that the Israelites went through to get to this point. And so I hope you return to us next time as we explore the New Testament first, what happened before the New Testament events take place. We're going to look at the time of Jesus. We're going to look at the time of Acts and the disciples and Paul. And then we're also going to look at after the New Testament, what happens immediately after what happens to Paul, what happens to John. So stay tuned for that. I hope, we'll have a pretty big gathering to really explore the New Testament next semester. So thank you so much for joining us.